All right, hey class, this is chapter 10. Hopefully you have noticed I posted a couple places. I had originally said we were going to cover chapter 9 and 10 this week, but after looking at it, I realized there's a lot of stuff in chapter 10 that I don't think is really that necessary and important. It gets into a little too much detail. So chapter 10.2, section 10.2 is called Determining the Level of Consumption. That's really all you need to read out of chapter 10, so that's all I'm going to cover in this video. And this one should be fairly short. So most importantly, this section of the chapter introduces you to the consumption function. So consumption, remember, is that part of aggregate demand that refers to spending by households for final goods and services. It's the biggest component of GDP, but not the only one. And so the graph that you see here shows the consumption function in green, which is a relationship between, it's hard to see because I think the screencastify thing's blocking it, but on the horizontal axis at the bottom is disposable personal income. I think it's for a month. And on the vertical axis is consumption and saving. But right now we'll talk about consumption. The black line at the 45-degree angle is a line where your consumption equals your income. So anywhere on the black line, that means that people on average are spending everything that they're making. So the consumption function has a positive slope, as that should make sense. That's basically saying that as people get more disposable income, they're going to spend more in consumption. So that makes sense. Interestingly, though, if you look at some of the lower levels of income down at points like A, B, and C on this graph, consumption is above that black line. That means that people on average are spending more than they're making. So how is that possible? Either people have savings that they're dipping into and they're spending that, or they're living on credit, they're running up debt on their credit cards or something like that. So it is possible. It's obviously not advisable for the long haul, but it is statistically shown that at lower levels of income, people on average spend more than they earn. Similarly, you'll see the saving function down below that in yellow, and it should also make sense that when your consumption is more than your income, you're actually de-saving. You're saving a negative amount, which means you're taking money away from savings or you're accumulating debt. But once you get past point D on the graph, heading up toward point E, then incomes are high enough that people are able to save some, so the saving function becomes positive and the consumption function is below that black line. So that's basically what the consumption function tells us. There's an important concept in here, which we'll come back to again a couple times in the class, called marginal propensity to consume. And there's a parallel idea, marginal propensity to save. But marginal propensity to consume refers to how much, if you get some additional income, you get a raise or a bonus or something like that, how much of that additional income do you spend? That's your MPC. So mathematically, it's a simple formula. It's the change in consumption over a change in disposable income. So it has to be a change in income. And throughout this chapter, we assume that there are only two things that households can do with their income. They either consume, which means they spend it on goods and services, or they save. So anything that you might think of like buying stocks or investing and things like that, that's still considered saving. So you basically either consume or you spend. So that's why MPC plus MPS equals 1, because whatever your marginal propensity to consume is, if that's 0.8, that means you spend 80% of your additional income. Then your MPS must be 0.2 because you save the other 20%. So an example appears in the right column. Let's say my July disposable income was $3,000, and of that I spent $2,500. You can calculate my average propensity to consume based on that, but we're looking for the marginal, so we have to have a change. So let's say I get a raise in August and my disposable income goes up to $3,500. I increase my spending to $2,800. So MPC is the change in consumption, so that's $2,800 minus $2,500, so that's $300. My consumption went up by $300 when my income went up by $500. So if you divide those, you get 0.6. So basically that says that when I get additional income, I tend to spend 60% of it and save 40%. There's a formula that you'll see. You can do the same thing to calculate marginal propensity to save. It's just change in savings over change in income. But if MPC is 0.6, we know MPS is 0.4. But if you wanted to go through the math and just prove that, that might be a good idea. So let's relate to the last two slides. The slope of the consumption function is the marginal propensity to consume. So if you take the green consumption function here, the slope is rise over run. So just going between points C and D there, the rise is 400, the run is 500, 400 over 500 is 0.8. That consumption function has the equation 300 billion plus 0.8 YD. So if you remember your algebra, that coefficient 0.8 is the slope of that line, because for every extra dollar in income, you multiply that by 0.8, and 0.8 gets added to the consumption. So for a $1 change in income, consumption goes up by 0.8. That's marginal propensity to consume. So the slope of the consumption function is the MPC. And hopefully you understand now why MPS would have to be 0.2 in this case. Okay, just like with supply and demand curves, there's a difference between a movement along a curve and a shift of a curve. So if we're thinking about a consumption function, say you start out at point A, if a person gets an increase in disposable income, they might move up to point B. So that's a movement along a curve, because what the consumption function shows us is as income increases, consumption increases. So moving from A to B demonstrates that. A shift of the consumption function means at all levels of income you would spend more. So C1 shifts all the way up to C2. That's a shift of the curve. That could happen basically due to two things. One would be change in real wealth. So that can happen just over time as you accumulate more and more savings. You have retirement savings built up. You feel a little bit, you start to feel wealthier just because you have this money put away. People will spend more, or if you inherit a bunch of money that increases your real wealth, you'll spend more. And it can change due to expectations of the future and your confidence in the future of the economy, the future of your employment situation, things like that. So anything that changes either one of those things can cause a consumption function to go up or down. But that's the difference between a shift of a curve and a movement along a curve in this case. All right, so that's pretty much it. We've talked a lot about consumption and things, so I'm going to leave you with this silly cartoon, which I'll leave you a second to look at, but that concludes 10.2. So thanks. I'll see you next week.